Hi guys, welcome back. A bit more firearms related stuff today, and I'm going to be talking about shotgun cartridges. So there is a lot of stuff out there about cartridges. I see a lot of people chatting on forums about them, and there's a lot of myths surrounding, what makes a good cartridge and what doesn't. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, based on the fact that for about 8 or 9 years, I worked with a company and part of our manufacture was 12 gauge cartridges. We were making them for a slightly different industry. We were making them for the defense industry, but they were the same thing. They weren't much different. They had some slightly different parameters to do with waterproofing and such. Other than that, in effect, they were exactly the same things as you might use for sporting, and we were lucky enough to gather a lot of data and use a lot of different components in those, so different types of wads, different types of shot, and different types of propellant, and then we would pressure test those through a barrel, which I'll get into in a minute, and that would give us a lot of information. We would pattern test them, and that was done for over a period of years with many different variations. So I'm lucky enough to have some data to fall back on, that instead of just sort of saying, hey, that one felt a bit nicer than this one. There's lots of people I see talking about that and saying, oh, I shot this and I didn't like the feel of it, and that's fine if that's your personal choice, but that can sometimes be very misleading, because if you're having an off day, you're not as full of energy as you were the day before, or you're just feeling a bit low, or whatever it is, that can seriously affect how you feel the cartridges, and that's not a scientific means of evaluating a product. And this will hopefully give you guys some idea of what could possibly be marketing hype and the things that you look out for that will make a good shotgun cartridge. I'm going to be looking at 12 gauge because that's what I've used, that's what we've built, but you could in effect take a lot of this information and actually pass it down the line to any of the other sporting gauges that people might use. So first and foremost, I'll go over what is in a cartridge, just for people that actually don't know and haven't even looked before. I'm sure most of you will have a pretty good idea of what a shotgun cartridge is made up of. So if we look on the outside of a shotgun cartridge, you can basically see the case head here, which is metallic and often in a brassy colour. These Fiocchis are a silver colour. You have a primer in the back there, so that's what the firing pin impacts on and causes energy to be released into the propellant. And then you have this plastic case here, which is star crimped at the front. Sometimes they're roll crimped. We used to do a lot of roll crimping, but these are star crimped. So that is done in a metallic die. The cartridge is just pressed down into a die, and the die itself will give that crimp. So first thing I want to talk about is what you see on a lot of cartridges is discussion about the length of this brass on here, and we would call that the head of the cartridge, but some people just say length of brass. And in expensive cartridges, it could almost take up half the length of that. You often see that on game shoots and stuff. People bring in really expensive game cartridges that have this really long brass on them. What sort of benefit is that? Well, to be honest, the only benefit I could imagine would be if you were having trouble extracting or ejecting cartridges, which these days in modern times, that really isn't a thing, because it lends absolutely no benefit whatsoever to the the pattern of the shot, to the accuracy of the cartridge, to the velocity SD. It has nothing to do with any of those whatsoever. I think personally this goes to back in the day when this plastic part that we just looked at, that used to be made of cardboard. And back in the day, I'm sure if you had a really short brass piece in there, then there would be a big chance that you might have some extraction issues. And also, of course, the guns back in the day were maybe not as proficient as they are now. The standard gun that people may have had maybe wouldn't have been as well made as a standard gun is nowadays. So I'm sure that there were a lot more extraction issues, and if you had a longer piece of brass, that would probably go some way to mitigating extracting those cartridges and ejecting those cartridges. And now it's become synonymous with kind of money, and they obviously cost a lot more, so people want to show off and have this really long brass on their cartridges. Nothing wrong with that, we all like to show off, but if you've got any ideas that you must have that because it's some sort of real world performance benefit, it simply is not. The primers on these are important. You can buy cheap primers and good primers. There's a bit of sensitive material in a primer, and there's a small anvil, they call it, and when the outside of the primer gets struck by a firing pin, that sensitive material gets hammered by the anvil and it causes igniferous particles to be ejected, and they then eject into the propellant, igniting the propellant. And it's important that the propellant there is ignited in a very, very consistent manner, and that gives you a very consistent velocity. If, for example, you used a very cheap primer or a degraded primer that had got damp or had been heated and cooled over a long period of time, so inappropriately stored primers or damp primers, then they're going to be inconsistent. They're going to ignite your propellant inconsistently, and that's going to lead to big differences in your velocities. That's obviously going to compute to a performance problem, because if you've got one cartridge and you shoot it and your lead shot's coming out at 1350 FPS, and then you shoot it again and it's only coming out at 950 FPS, that's going to affect your timing. You know, I shoot DTL, so I sort of time the speed of my barrel as I shoot those clays, and if I've got a hugely different velocity, then that may make the difference between breaking and not breaking, because that will equate to a miss based on the fact that your timing is out. Certainly that's going to make a difference in terms of lead. You know, if you're a sporting shooter or you're a game shooter and you're shooting really long targets and you're putting lead on, then a vastly different velocity is going to equate to quite a considerable difference in lead, and that's also going to equate to a difference in fall of shot as well. So you're going to maybe have to aim higher, put more lead on or less lead on, whichever it is, depending on which velocity you're getting out the end of that barrel. So that's why it's so important to have consistent velocity, because you're going to want to do the same thing every time. You know that when you see a target at X distance and you're used to putting X amount of lead on it, that's what you want to be doing all the time. If you're using vastly different velocities from one cartridge to the next, that's going to make your job a lot more difficult. So primer quality is important. You know, you can source very good primers and you can source very, very cheap primers that have got lower QC. To be honest, these days, most of the available primers are of good quality, because primer manufacturers would simply go out of business if they didn't work very well. It's also quite a dangerous thing to produce primers, so the factories that make them tend to be quite heavily regulated. So unless someone's sourcing primers from some sort of, you know, very sort of ramshackle third world country, I can't even think of a manufacturer offhand. But if there were such primers around, or more to the point, primers have been stored for extended periods of time in very, very bad environments, and they've been heated and cooled over these long periods, then you're going to start to see inconsistency, and that can happen. So that'll be where people start to see maybe what they would call a bad batch. Most quality manufacturers of 12 gauge cartridges know all about how these things should be stored, so they will buy primers off a manufacturer that hopefully has stored them correctly, because they also know about the storage. They will be manufactured and they will hopefully be stored in the same manner here, and then go on to be used in product. That product will then go out to a store. They will then be stored in that shop for a fairly short period of time before going out the door. The shop is probably the place where you're likely to see less care taken over storage. just because, you know, they may be short on space, they may be utilizing outbuildings and stuff like that to store cartridges in, and they might not have a highly scientific way of regulating humidity and temperature in those rooms. So for example, it might get really cold overnight and then they might heat it in the day when people are actually in the shop. Hopefully the cartridges won't sit around in that shop for so long that they're going to be affected, because it is length of time with that kind of stuff. But I would suggest, you know, trying to buy from a shop that has a pretty good flow of cartridges going through it, and that way you're not getting something out the back that's been covered in dust for the last 10 years and they've just sort of dragged it out for you. If it's noticeably old, then the chances of a problem being evident are increased. Now, the crimp can start to affect pressure, so the crimp needs to be consistent. If the crimp isn't consistent, you do see pressure differences. So we have fired quite a lot of 12 gauge through a pressure barrel. So that is a barrel with a port drilled into it. So they basically tap a hole in the barrel, then it's got a piezo measuring device in that hole, which will take a pressure reading every time you fire. That pressure reading will also pertain to what kind of velocity you're getting out the end. Obviously, higher pressure, higher velocity, less pressure, less velocity. You are limited to pressure by CIP in Europe, and therefore the manufacturers have to stick to within a safe pressure limit as defined by CIP. Now, if they have a very inconsistent crimping process, so this is something you might see when people do a lot of home loading of shotgun shells, and if they're not very good at it, you will see the crimps are very badly done. You know, they'll be completely inconsistent just visually when you look from one to the next. That's the sort of thing that's going to vary pressure, because in simple terms, as the propellant is igniting within that case, the amount of energy it gives out as it opens up that crimp is going to differ each time. And if you've got a crimp that's kind of partially open anyway, that's going to be a lot different to a crimp that's almost completely sealed. And if you're putting sealant on these things, then again, you know, if you put a load of sealant across one and hardly any on another, that's going to make a difference. They don't make huge differences to pressure, but they do make some. So it's definitely worth buying off a reliable manufacturer that has their crimping process correct. And if you opened up a package of 12 gauge and you saw that there were wild differences in the crimping, I mean, for a start, that lets you know that the manufacturer probably isn't doing due diligence, or you've got a bad batch. And the likelihood of other things being wrong with that escalates, because if they haven't had quality control in place to spot the crimping problem, there may be other issues there as well. But certainly something to bear in mind. Now, if we cut one of these open, so what we can see inside is the top of the wad and some propellant. Be careful not to spill it everywhere. So if I pull the wad out of here, so there we have our wad, and that is simply like a plastic cup at the front, and then it's got this like a springy part in the middle, and then a shallower cup section at the back. So this back part is giving you a gas seal within the barrel. This part we'll talk about is supposed to have some sort of shock absorbing effect. And then this is the part that actually holds your lead shot or steel shot or whichever you would have. Now, you can also get fibre wads. I haven't got any of those here. I don't generally use them. Some grounds insist on them. And fibre wads just look like a disc made out of compressed fibres. And they're not particularly usable with steel, because of course the steel would be coming into contact with the inside of your barrel, so you won't tend to find fibre wads with steel shot. And like I said, some grounds will insist on them because they just can dissipate, you know, they're biodegradable pretty much. There are biodegradable wads like this coming onto the market. They're fairly new and they break down over time and just dissipate into the soil. But most people are going to be using plastic wads, especially if they're shooting clay competitions. These are definitely the most popular choice. So any issues with these? Now, a lot of companies make a really, really big deal about the wads, and they will tell you that they've got some sort of special technology, and it centers around this part in the middle, which I just showed you, that sort of springy part there. And they will talk about how that is this great absorber of recoil. Now, we have used a ton of different wads when we used to manufacture 12 gauge, and part of the reason was because wads were one of the hardest things for us to source in volume. They would often be sold out, and you would have to, you know, get wads from a different manufacturer. Especially in the last 5 years, you know, wads have become, since COVID as well, wads have become increasingly hard to source, and therefore you pretty much, if you're making 12 gauge ammunition, you either make your own wads or you have to use what you can get. A lot of the big manufacturers will make their own wads or have a company that makes wads for them, and it will be specific to them. I think because it's specific to them and they're not selling them out to anyone else, they will obviously use that as marketing as well and talk about the wad having some sort of perceived benefit. What I can tell you is that we never saw any differences in pressure or velocity based on the design of the middle of that wad. If you don't see any difference in pressure and velocity, and you're using the same amount of lead shot or the same weight of load in that cartridge, there is no difference to recoil. You know, the things that are going to affect recoil are going to be your weight of shot and your pressure peak and your pressure over time. So you're going to get a pressure curve, and it's that pressure over time. So you might get the same amount of pressure from two cartridges. One cartridge has a longer pressure over time, so it's more of a plateau on the pressure, and another might have a really sharp peak of pressure that suddenly goes back down. Same amount in both, but a different looking curve. That's going to affect recoil. So a sort of longer pressure curve, you know, pressure over time being a bit longer, is going to make the recoil feel less sharp, and it will still give you a bump, but it won't be such a sharp thwack. If you've got a high peak that drops off quickly, then likelihood is it's going to feel a little bit sharper. And I would liken that to one feeling a bit like a shove, and one feeling a bit like a quick snappy punch, you know, that they're giving you the same amount of energy almost, but in two slightly different ways. We never saw any difference with these things. I can't say that companies are, you know, making stuff up about their wads, because they might have used some sort of wad that we never came across, but we did use a lot of different wads. All I can say is that from what we saw, it had no effect. What would have an effect is if you had a difference in this piece at the bottom, which actually gives you the gas seal. If you had a poor gas seal on the bottom of that wad, then you would definitely see a difference in recoil, but you would also see a difference in your velocity, which isn't good, because if you've got an inconsistent or poor gas seal, we're back to having these inconsistent velocities or lower velocities, because gas will be escaping around that wad, and instead of driving the whole thing down the barrel, you know, part of it will be driving it down the barrel and the other half will be bleeding around the edges and will be exiting the barrel before your load does. So that's not at all ideal. It's very inefficient. It will probably lead to inefficient propellant burns as well, because the propellant is designed to burn at a certain rate. If you've got gas flowing around that wad, that's going to affect the whole ignition chain of that cartridge. So next we've got the propellant, which I don't know if you can make out those flakes on my hand. So the propellant comes in quite a few different shapes and sizes, and the different shapes and sizes of that propellant will affect burn rate. You will also see it in slightly different colours. That has more to do with the chemicals that specific manufacturer has used, or they may even colour it just to give their propellant a kind of noticeable difference to the others. This specific one is a light green colour, and it's kind of small oval flakes that are very flat. So shotgun propellant is pretty fast. It has to be because of the nature of shotguns. It's not pushing a very tight-fitting bullet up a rifled barrel. It's pushing a quite loose-fitting wad with some shot in it up a smoothbore barrel. So by its nature, it has to generate quite a lot of energy very quickly. So it's a fast burning propellant, but there will be slight differences in burn rates, and there will be slight differences in the quality consistency from one manufacturer to another. So there are better propellants and there are worse propellants, if you like. That will also be dependent on the weight of shot you've got in there, and you know, there will be some propellants that are more suited to a certain weight of shot than others, and really it's the manufacturer's job that's putting these cartridges together to weigh that up and find out, you know, what's a good combination of primer, propellant, and the weight of the projectile that they're trying to get out of the end of that shotgun. When they've balanced those things up, you know, that's where they get their recipe for a good cartridge. Propellant choice is important. You know, there are expensive propellants and there are cheaper propellants. So you might find that in some cheaper cartridges, you know, they've kind of cheaped out on the propellant selection. It's certainly possible that you would see a recoil difference from the propellant selection. So again, you might have two propellants that are delivering energy in slightly different pressure curves, and that's going to give you a different recoil feel. So even though it might deliver the same amount of energy, again, it may feel a little bit different in the shoulder. One may feel sharper than another. And I think this is where, if you're paying a lot of money for a cartridge and you want a soft shooting cartridge, and you still want to deliver a decent load down range, then that's where you're going to be paying, you know, for high quality propellant and for the R&D and the time that goes into blending those things together. Because don't forget, they're also going to have to source this propellant in huge quantities. You know, it's no good a cartridge manufacturer just buying a ton or so and then hoping that they can buy some more further down the line. Once they've got this recipe, they're going to have to tie themselves into a deal and buy huge quantities of propellant from that manufacturer for years to come. And they're not going to want to change that recipe if they can help it, because then it's back to the drawing board and back to testing. So yes, propellant will definitely make a difference. And if you find a cartridge that you specifically like in your gun, then it's worth sticking with until something changes. And I say in your gun because we also must consider that all the guns are going to be slightly different in the way that they deal with these cartridges. So you might find just from the internals in the barrel that one cartridge, you know, performs a little better than another, and that may not be the same in all shotguns. For a good example, I'm shooting this Beretta DT11, and that has what they call the Stelium Pro barrels. And what that refers to is, apart from the materials that they use to make the barrels, but there's actually here a forcing cone, and some of the guns would refer to that as back boring. And basically the barrel starts off wider and inside it gets thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner. Normally on a shotgun you would see a forcing cone maybe from sort of here to there, you know, so it'd be quite short, and then the rest of the barrel would all be the standard dimension you would expect from the bore of a 12 gauge. In this barrel, the forcing cone actually goes right along the length of the barrel and is almost up to the end. You know, it stops around here, and then it's just this part of the barrel here that's your standard sort of 12 gauge dimension, and that does affect the recoil impulse. There's no doubt about it. Beretta have done many tests, you know, with far better equipment than we had access to when we were manufacturing ammunition, and there's absolutely no doubt that that back bore or the forcing cone difference makes a hell of a difference to recoil. I've shot this gun with similar weight guns that do not have that system in them, so they've got the more traditional shorter forcing cone and then a longer section of barrel that's your standard 12 gauge dimension, and the recoil was noticeably less in this gun. It was like a smoother impulse, which Again, we're getting back into that. You're not going to see a huge difference in peak pressure, because if you saw huge differences in peak pressure, you would see massive differences in velocity, which you don't. But what you will do is there will be a difference in how that energy feels when it impacts your shoulder. Again, this is more like a push than a sharp thwack, and I think it's a lot easier to shoot with that push rather than that tight crack in the shoulder, and that can become uncomfortable for people if you're shooting something that's 100 cartridges, you know, over an hour or two. Then you're probably not going to enjoy constantly getting whacked by something. The people call them thumpy cartridges, but I've also shot really thumpy guns. So one of the things with a gun that will soak up recoil is the weight of the gun itself, because obviously the energy moving the gun backwards, it has to move the weight of the gun backwards. So the more weight the gun has, the less sharp that recoil is going to be. So with this one, it's quite a heavy gun. It's a trap gun. I think it's around 9 pounds, so pretty heavy as shotguns go. Then of course you've got that backbore technology, the Stelium Pro technology in there as well. And both of those things make it a really, really nicely recoiling gun. The importance for me being I can get onto my second shot without being pushed off target. So even though I'm a fairly big guy and I'm fairly strong, if I'm taking recoil, it's going to affect their ability to make a second shot. It's going to affect their accuracy. So I don't want to be pushed around too much. I want to make sure that my second shot actually hits something. Now, the lead shot is reasonably important because it will deform. You know, if it's 100% lead, it's going to be quite soft, and as it makes its way up the barrel and into the chokes, it's going to compress slightly, and that will deform the lead shot, and any deformed shot is going to affect your pattern. So we used to see this quite a bit in pattern testing. You know, especially if you're running heavier loads, say 28 or 32 gram loads, and then you're restricting that wad and shot, say in a modified, improved modified, or a full choke, then you're going to find that some of that lead deforms. That's going to make its way away from the other lead shot, because suddenly it's not going to be flying the same. It's going to affect its trajectory. It's going to drop away. It won't have the same efficiency as it's flying through the air, and that will fall away a lot quicker than the rest of the shot does. So you might see it pattern really low, or it might just drift away and not even turn up on the pattern plate at all. So you're in effect losing shot from your pattern, and it will certainly give you an inconsistent pattern because it's not going to fall in the same place as the rest of the shot. What they tend to do is increase the quantity of antimony in the shot. This makes it slightly harder, so it's still soft enough that it's not going to damage your gun or anything like that, and it's still nice and heavy and dense. You know, that's why they like lead, is because the denser it is, obviously the more efficient it's going to be at flying through the air, and it's also going to have some nice terminal energy when it actually gets to the target to break a clay or to hit a bird or whatever you're doing. If that shot is slightly harder, then it's going to avoid deformation and it's going to pattern a lot better. That may be where quality of wad also comes in, because if you have a really bad quality wad, when it leaves the barrel it starts to be very inconsistent, then that may affect your shot patterning as well. I don't think we ever saw that at work. We've never seen wads of such bad quality that they actually began tumbling as soon as they came out the barrel, or yawing to any huge amount. But it's, you know, it's not improbable. If you cheaped out enough, you would certainly have some issues there. It could pay to buy, you know, premium cartridges that have a higher antimony content, a little bit more resilient to deformation, and that's certainly what we see at the premium end of the range. I'm by no means a expert clay shooter. I've been shooting, you know, shotguns in a practical sense mostly. It's only recently that I took up sporting shotgun stuff. Currently I use the Fiocchi F Blacks just based on the fact that they were very, very well priced, and I've known that Fiocchi have made some pretty good products for quite a few years just through my industry connections. And not only that, I know quite a lot of very good shooters that are happily using Fiocchi F Blacks and F Blues, and they're saying the same thing. You know, the quality you get from those guys for that price is phenomenal. In the UK at the moment, they're about 270 a thousand if you're you know, buying them in a shop. And I would say at the moment, you know, at 270 per thousand, which is a comparatively cheap cartridge at the moment, you know, the performance that the Fiocchis give are, you know, I've got no complaints with them whatsoever. I've shot some reg to comps with them, been more than happy. I do all my practice with them, very happy with that. I've also been shooting these Cleaver Grand Italias, and they've been very good as well. They are a little bit more expensive. They're about 340 per thousand, I think, if my mind serves me right. And to be honest, you know, I struggle to tell the difference. I'm probably not good enough. In DTO, I'm shooting like 95s out of 100. So I'm not a guy that's shooting like consistent hundreds and can change cartridges and tell you, oh, that's why I dropped those 2 shots. All I know is that both of these cartridges shoot well. I've also used cartridges from Ely. I've used their DTL cartridges. They were really good. The only cartridges I try and avoid are ones that are a little thumpier, but to be honest, they tend to be more towards the game variety. I've had a couple of different cartridges that weren't breaking the clays as well. You know, it was noticeable. But that was probably more down to gun specifics. You know, for this specific gun, I've tried a load of different cartridges, and these I found work really well. I'm sure there are others in the, you know, the higher price bracket which I haven't tried that would also work equally well. But these cartridges do what I need them to do at the moment. There may be a time when I explore premium range cartridges and take a look at those, but I'm getting good breaks with these. There have been some other cartridges, like I say, that didn't produce great breaks. That's probably because they patterned a little bit differently. That doesn't mean they're bad cartridges, because you could shoot them in a different gun and they could be absolutely excellent. And it just means that for my specific gun, they weren't performing that well. But the only way you can find that out is by trying them. So I wouldn't write off any cartridges just based on their price. I would take with a pinch of salt some of the stuff that people say about WAD technology. I think most of the WADs on the market these days are pretty much the same. But you can certainly buy your way into a softer feeling cartridge, and you can certainly buy your way into less deformation of shot. So, you know, there's 2 things you could definitely get. And if you're paying more money, the chances are that those things are more likely to happen. You can also make sure you're buying into that combination of the primer, propellant versus the shot weight that you've got in that cartridge. And if the manufacturer's done a really good job of balancing those out, again, that's going to be a cartridge that performs well, that gives you a manageable recoil impulse and still breaks the clays really nicely at good velocity. Guys, I hope that was of use to you. Hopefully I've brought you some information from the industry side that you wouldn't normally hear. If you got any comments, stick them down below as always. As long as the comments stay sensible, which thank God they have done lately, I'll keep them flowing. If it gets crazy again, obviously I'll have to review that, but at the moment everyone's being sensible, so thank you very much for that. I hope to bring you some new stuff soon. Hopefully we will have some more outdoorsy knife videos. We will have some more stuff from the clay range, and as the weather gets better I'll be bringing you some stuff from the rifle range as well. We got some more from Arken Optics coming up. I've got to mount that on a rifle and get shooting, so hopefully the weather will improve a little bit. We've got floods and freezing rain and all kinds at the moment, so when that improves we'll get ourselves down the range and make some video. Take care guys, have a good one, see you soon.